Welcome back to School for Relationships. Here we finally are to talk about how to heal from codependency. Good news, if you've watched my other videos and you have an understanding of what codependency is, you are more than halfway there. Codependency is really one of those things where building an awareness of what this relationship pattern is, how it works, is half the battle. And that's especially true because we've looked at those deeper roots of codependency, and that information can help us heal this relationship pattern from the roots up. So with that, our goals in the next few videos are number 1, to heal our codependent relationships, and number 2, to heal the roots of codependency within. That's going to bring us more into talking about unconditional self-worth later on. In this video, we're really focusing on our first goal, healing our codependent relationships. And our main topics for this video are going to focus around developing self-awareness and learning boundary setting and communication skills. And while different strategies can be helpful for someone who tends to overassume responsibility or underassume responsibility, most of the strategies we're learning actually apply to both parties. There might be a different nuance for someone who overfunctions or underfunctions, but the strategies are universally helpful. And we'll have videos later on that can go more into strategies for the overfunctioning and the underfunctioning person. But right now we're just talking about strategies that can be helpful for everyone. So I want to acknowledge before we're going into strategy talk that if codependency is really all you've ever known and might be the norm for a lot of your relationships, healing from codependency or unlearning this can feel really overwhelming and intimidating. And I want us to just remember that because codependency is a learned way of relating to others, we can learn new ways throughout our lives, no matter our life stage. And so what we're here to do in this video is to provide information so that you can feel more supported in the process of healing your relationships, and also just more hopeful and optimistic about where this will take you. So where is this taking us? When we're trying to heal from codependency, we don't want to just be moving and striving towards the other extreme of total independence or self-sufficiency, which is pretty much impossible. We actually want to just find a middle ground, and this middle ground is interdependent relationships. So what is interdependence? The way I define it is an interdependent relationship is one where everyone in that relationship can still depend on each other, can still support each other, while retaining autonomy and responsibility for what is within our individual control. So just like codependency is possible in all kinds of relationships, so is interdependence. We can see interdependence in more surface level or transactional relationships, and we can also build this in our deepest and most intimate relationships. Now, of course, depending on the type of relationship, how responsibility is divided up will differ. That's also going to depend on each individual's strengths, interests, and capacity at that time. We're again just looking for a mutual sense of reciprocity in that relationship long term. And when we're starting to build interdependent relationship skills, what we're looking to feel, the first sign of interdependence, is as we've gotten to know a person, feeling safe and respected being ourselves around them without the pressure to change. And a lot of this comes from the fact that codependent relationships typically involve some level of enmeshment or blurry boundaries. Boundaries within an interdependent relationship protect everyone in that relationship by allowing everyone to remain wholly themselves without that pressure to change or be different, and still get to connect and experience intimacy and support. The other sign we're looking for to know we're in an interdependent relationship is these are relationships that over time give us back either the same or more energy than we put in. So we're feeling at least neutral after interactions with that person, if not actually more energized. And in this way, interdependent relationships really add to and support and enrich everyone involved in that relationship. And these are relationships where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So we are able to do and accomplish more in an interdependent relationship than we could do on our own. How do we get there? The first thing we'll be talking about is building self-awareness. Y'all are already here to build awareness of codependent dynamics. Let's talk about how self-awareness fits into this. We're starting to really tune into our energy levels and our capacity at any given point in time. And my big recommendation here is tuning out of our minds and thoughts, because our minds will tend to think that we're either capable of often way more or way less than we are, but our bodies know. So tuning into that innate wisdom of our bodies provide a steady stream of information to us all day long on our energy and capacity levels. And what we're paying attention to with our bodies is primarily physical sensations, where our energy level is at, and how those two things connect to our emotional experience at that time. So while our body is going to go through different cycles, even within one day, we're looking for long-term patterns, like over weeks. So for someone who tends to overfunction, our long-term physical pattern is feeling heightened levels of tension, drain, strain, tightness, and like pressure or compression. And when we're underfunctioning, physically what our bodies are feeling is overwhelmed, maybe numb, shut down. We might feel stuck or trapped, and even dissociate. And so all these feelings I just named, we will all experience them at some point. They will come and they will go, because again, our capacity and our emotions and our energy fluctuates with the time of day, time of year, even cycle of the moon. And a lot of what makes our capacity fluctuate depends on the resources that we have access to. These are internal resources, coping tools, information, but it's also external resources and support systems. And we can build our capacity energetically and emotionally over time by connecting to more of these resources. But I would say first and foremost, let's just start by honoring that our capacity has a limit. So I want to close here with an analogy for the self-awareness piece. I'm going to be comparing our bodies to a car. And I just want you to think of you, like in your body, having a gas tank. And this is an energetic, emotional gas tank. And just like a car, we have to fuel that tank. We want to keep it at least empty or neutral or above. And with what fuels our inner gas tank, we're looking at core universal human needs. And if we're still trying to understand like what are universal human needs, a really great place to start is Maslow's hierarchy. You might have seen that pyramid before. We're looking at that pyramid where, he breaks down physical and survival related needs, kind of basic needs for safety, comfort here on the bottom. And then we go up to needs that are social, needs for belonging and inclusion. And then we move up to needs that go into self-esteem and self-acceptance, all the way up to the top of the pyramid, which is self-actualization. So anything within that pyramid serves as fuel that is giving energy back to us and increasing our capacity to keep going and traveling longer distances. But we want to pay a little bit of attention to the types of fuels we're putting into our body, especially short versus long-term impact. There might be some things that feel really good and fuel us in the short term. Maybe we're thinking about like binging a TV show late at night. But then long term, does that thing actually take away more energy than I had to begin with? And we want both short and long term sources of fuel. We need both. I'm not saying like short term is bad, but we do want a balance of them. And if we can find some things that give back to us short and long term, that is one of the best ways to maintain like a more sustainable level of health and well-being, especially long term. You can almost think of the long-term fuel as like the maintenance checks for your car, putting oil in the car, which is just as important. So without these maintenance checks, the short-term fuel, our cars are going to start flashing warning lights at us. And we can think of these warning lights as mild physical or mental health symptoms. And then we either heed the warning light, or if we're continuing to push past those limits without refueling, something will eventually break down and stop functioning. And there are times in our lives where we may push at our capacity, but ideally this is something that is chosen, it's intentional, and it has a time limit before we're like looking to refuel. So hopefully this is super clear by now. I think that understanding our needs and limits, it feels simple, especially like mentally, but it's one of the hardest practices to actually live by. Living in a way that honors our limits is radical. And I say this as a therapist living and working with clients in a Western capitalist context. And a capitalist system treats more as better, and there's this expectation for ongoing, fast-paced growth. And there's an essay I really love by Tema Okun that defines some of the like main characteristics of like dominant Western culture. And this is a culture that expects and favors perfectionism, a sense of urgency, quantity over quality, and progress meaning bigger and more. So given those characteristics, a lot of our mainstream culture rejects the capacity of people as finite, also the capacity of our planet as finite, and we struggle to honor natural cycles and rhythms of activity and rest. And with the cycle and rhythm of rest or doing less, being more, feeling more, that type of space and way of being is often labeled as weak or lazy or less than in some way. And so many of us get this inherited burden where we're conditioned to view our needs and our limits as selfish and as something that burdens others. So when we hit an internal limit, we may feel an initial and immediate wave of guilt and shame, and then reflexively treat that limit as some kind of personal deficiency that we are then trying to hide or override and ignore. And we have some people in our overfunctioning boat that might reach that internal limit and push harder and kind of white knuckle and willpower their way to do more and give more. And then we have people in our underfunctioning boat that might get close to a limit and actually deflate and shut down, maybe giving up before they even reach their max capacity, out of shame that their max capacity isn't enough. So within each of us, there is a balance that we're trying to find of radical acceptance of our current limits, who we are like right now, and also feeling empowered that change is possible. We can choose change and expand and grow. And as we balance radical acceptance and change, I'm going to give just a silly example here, but let's say I feel like I haven't been doing a good job of staying in touch with my friends, my long distance friends, and I have a goal of reaching out to my friends more. If I'm starting with acceptance, I'm looking at my schedule first and I'm saying, how much free time do I have? How much free mental space do I have? What am I working with here? And then based on what my capacity is, what my limit is, I might be setting a goal for change around that. And my goal could start off as when I'm feeling inspired and have the energy, maybe once a month, I'm picking up the phone and instead of doing something else in that free time, I'm gonna go ahead and call a friend I haven't talked to in a while. So this is just one very concrete example. I would say in general, how much we're balancing change and acceptance is again such a personal equation. You could think of like our emotional and energetic capacity as like the physical capacity of an athlete. Some people are gonna want to go all the way and to train and to push and to see what am I capable of? What can I master? How can I be the best at this? Be like that professional athlete, so to speak. And others might really want to just learn skills that help them play the sport, like play life, have fun, engage with others. And it's like optimizing like well-being, quality of life. And so that person might tend towards higher levels of acceptance and lower levels of wanting or needing so much change. Wherever you are in your preferences for change, for acceptance of where you're at, wherever the change is coming from, I just want us to check ourselves and see, is this coming from a place of obligation or pressure, or out of a genuine desire for self-growth, because this is fulfilling for me? So now that we've talked a lot about accepting our limits, let's talk about how we do that in practice. And this is where we're going to talk boundaries. So boundaries is a big buzzword because it's like kind of so commonly used. I'm actually going to pause and just define it for what we mean and what I mean by it in this video. A boundary is a limit that protects our autonomy and individuality. And it does so by setting a realistic threshold for how and how much we're participating in an activity or a relationship. And boundaries are so important, particularly healing from codependency, because they both reflect self-worth out to others while also building self-worth internally. And just like most other relational skills, boundaries are something we most often learn or don't learn in childhood. For some people, we might have grown up in a family or a context where our boundaries were openly ignored and disrespected. We might have other people who grew up with parents or family members who were themselves kind of socialized and brought up to view boundaries as selfish and a burden to others. And so, if we are still really learning how to set boundaries for the first time, this is a skill that can absolutely be developed, again, throughout adulthood. And what we're going to do in talking about boundaries is start with a list of the most foundational boundaries for healing from codependency. And this list is a starting point that's more of kind of a universal list. As you refine your boundary setting skills, that's where you get into the fun and juicy territory of practicing setting boundaries that are more personal to you, more unique. These might be boundaries around things that you need and prefer that others don't need and prefer on the same level. And when you're setting those much more unique and personal boundaries, my main advice is coming back to what your body is telling you. Trying to follow and honor what feels good or at least better, and to limit what drains your energy and internal resources. So having said that, let's go into our list. We're gonna go through 10 of the most fundamental boundaries for healing from codependency. And this list is not mine. Psychotherapist Darlene Lancer created this list. I've tweaked a few things, but what's really helpful if, listening to me talk gets hard to follow at a certain point, I've included in the description a link to Darlene Lancer's website, and you can pull up this list and be reading along and reading through as I'm talking. So I hope that helps, but let's get into it. The first boundary we're looking at for healing from codependency is, as much as is in your control, not letting others abuse or exploit you. And I added this piece, as much as is in your control, because we know that abuse and exploitation can often be out of someone's control. But we still want to be looking, even in that situation, at what can I control? Or how can I at least get back to a place where I have more control and more choices and options again? The second really tricky boundary we're talking about is not feeling responsible for other able adults. This is a tough one, and it just takes practice of letting go, especially. But it's something, keeping it on your mind. Am I starting to take responsibility for someone else's life, behavior, thoughts, emotions? And as you let go of taking responsibility for other people, that brings us to our third boundary on this list, which is focusing more and then valuing your own rights and feelings, your own experience and what is happening for you. And that can help with our next boundary, which is saying no without feeling guilty. That ties into boundary 5, holding your ground even when pressured. So saying no, holding your ground, this is a lot of how we maintain boundaries, how we stand in our self-worth, we stand in what works and feels best for us. And if there's someone that's pressuring us, we might either be looking at, is this a kind of unsafe relationship dynamic, or is that person kind of pushing at this boundary because they have a need that's not met? And is there a solution that can meet both needs while helping us stay in that boundary that feels good for us? Then let's go ahead and move on to number 6. Number 6 is not taking other people's criticism personally. This is one of those things, I'm going to say this, I'm planting that seed in your mind in full recognition of how hard this is. This is going to take practice, and I think what will really help with this one, with not taking other people's criticism personally, is some of the work we'll be doing in later videos on building unconditional self-worth. This all ties into our 7th main boundary, which is not needing others to agree with you. Again, that's going to take practice in building up of your own worth. And as you're practicing building your own worth, that's going to help with our 8th goal, which is taking responsibility for your own feelings and triggers. Some of this is just recognizing no one else can make me feel any kind of way. No one else is responsible for how I feel. They might have done something that had an impact that made me feel a certain way. But when that feeling comes up, we are responsible for that feeling. And this is tricky because we don't always choose our emotional reactions. Sometimes we can feel out of control of our own emotions and responses to something. So we may have that initial wave of something strong that comes up, especially with a trigger. But after that, we can still choose, and we are still responsible for how we respond and work with that emotion or that trigger. Let's go to number 9 on our list now, which is not being offended by other people's boundaries. That ties in with our last in the 10, respecting other people's boundaries. So these last two, not being offended by other people's boundaries, respecting their boundaries, if we're practicing setting boundaries ourselves, it's just as important that we're showing up and working with and honoring others that are trying to do the same thing. And that takes us into what is the intention of these boundaries. We've got this list of 10, which is kind of like your guideposts to be following and remembering and looking out for. But even with these 10, when we're first practicing this, I think a lot of the times boundaries may still feel for a long time selfish. We may feel like we're giving less or even taking away from people by setting a boundary. But if we lean in a little closer and examine this more carefully, intentionally set boundaries are actually one of the most loving and caring things we can do for someone else. As long as that boundary we're setting is in alignment with our own values of how we want to be treated, that boundary is such a deep act of love because it's nurturing and protecting our relationships and the long-term health of that relationship. A big part of that is we are honoring our own limits and therefore assuming responsibility for taking care of ourselves. Instead of putting that responsibility on someone else and expecting them to know or to know what we need, we're taking that responsibility on for ourselves. And as we take care of ourselves, that helps us show up in a more long-term and sustainable way to be even more giving and generous with others. Finally, communicating our needs and limits is such a powerful way of showing up more authentically in our relationship. We are letting the other person see us more clearly, oftentimes vulnerably. And this can serve to deepen the intimacy and closeness within a relationship. So in this way, boundaries that are set with intention and care really enrich and give back to everyone in that relationship. Even if someone doesn't like the boundary at first, there's so much room for negotiation and finding different strategies that meet everyone's needs. We'll be talking about that a lot more in the next video. I know this is a lot of information, so we're going to pause here. But coming up next, we'll be talking more about the process of how we both set and maintain boundaries. And this is boundaries for other people, but also internal boundaries we're setting for ourselves, just as important. So with the information we've covered so far, I hope you took away, a few little nuggets. You don't have to remember and digest this all at once, but even if you're just taking away one piece from this video, I'd love to hear what that is, and tune back in for part 2 to how to heal from codependency.